Your brain, as the teller, and the listener's brains literally behave as if they are inside the story. The most important part of a well-told story is to include answering the question, how did you feel? How did you feel? How did you feel? Because I haven't had every experience, but I have had almost every emotion. When you're telling the story of your broken down car and feeling shame at not getting your car service, it makes me feel better about who I am, and it reduces my shame. Like, your vulnerability makes me feel better about my vulnerability. Shame cannot survive connection.
Welcome to the Old Chicks No Shit podcast for midlife women who are ready to rewrite the rules and create their kick-ass next chapter. I'm Jennifer Arthurton, and each episode we dive into reinvention, resilience, and unapologetic pursuit of your best chapter yet. Because midlife is not the beginning of the end, it's simply a new beginning. Let's dive in. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the Old Chicks No Shit the Old Chicks No Shit podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the power of story, and the power of story to connect us to other people, but also to be able to see ourselves. And my guest today is Marsha Shandur, who is a storytelling and communication expert. Known for helping individuals and businesses craft compelling narratives that resonate with audiences. She is the founder of Yes, Marsha, a platform dedicated to teaching the art of storytelling for connection, persuasion, and public speaking. She is also a former DJ, a seasoned speaker, podcast guest, and writer with a knack for making storytelling accessible, engaging, no matter who the audience is. So welcome, Marsha. I am so happy to have this conversation with you because if anybody here is listening, you know that I love the power of story. I mean, it's the whole reason why I started this podcast is because I wanted midlife women who are struggling with the idea of like, what's next, to be able to get inspiration from other people's stories of like women who have reinvented themselves. And I know it was the inspiration that I needed when I was on my own journey of reinvention, and hearing other people's stories just opened up possibilities in my own life that I couldn't see for myself. So this is going to be a really juicy discussion. Welcome, Marsha.
I'm so thrilled to be here.
Like, I would love to know, like, what drew you to the power of storytelling?
So I'm Russian, which means that our currency is storytelling. You know, when I call my mom and ask her how, she doesn't say, "Hi, darling, how's Canada?" She says, "So there I am in the Gare du Nord in Paris, and I see that my train is leaving in 2 minutes. So I pick up my suitcase and run across the platform." Like, she can't not speak in stories. So I kind of grew up like immersed by stories. And then I used to listen to a lot of podcasts when I lived in London. I would commute, and I discovered the podcast This American Life, and it felt like time travel because I would get on the subway and then I would get off the subway again, seemingly 5 minutes, but actually an hour later. And so that, I mean, in itself is kind of journalism and storytelling. But through that, I discovered another podcast, which is called The Moth, which is live storytelling on stage. And I became just completely obsessed with it. And I went to, I was in New York, I went to a show, and at the time you could only buy CDs of the stories, and you could buy 10 CDs at a time, which had 12 stories on each. So I spent 3 months in London on the subway listening to stories. And I don't know if you know about the subway in London, but nobody talks to each other. And so I would be in this crowded, silent subway and sometimes burst out laughing, but more often than not just go, clap my hand to my face in shock because something very shocking had happened. Right. And when I moved to Toronto, first of all, I thought there must be something like this in London, and found a live storytelling show in in London, called True Stories Told Live. Told a story at it about my granny who'd brought me up, who died a couple of years before. And I felt like I got to spend time with her, which I now know the brain science behind storytelling, that when you tell a well-told story and your brain, as the teller, and the listener's brains literally behave as if they are inside the story. You talk about smelling coffee, my olfactory cortex lights up. I talk about grabbing a pen, your motor cortex lights up, specifically the part related to hand movement. So no wonder I felt like I got to spend time with her, because in a way I kind of did. I often say that storytelling is like time and space travel in that respect. And anyway, when I moved to Toronto, I asked if I could start a version of the show up here, and I did. And it started with, 3 people came, and I was related to 2 of them and very good friends with the third. But very quickly it grew to around 100, 150 people coming to every show. And I just loved it. And I sort of turned it into my job off the back of that, because I'd been coaching people. And even that, you mentioned that I was a radio DJ, that was my background. And on the way to coaching my first storyteller, I was thinking, who am I to coach a storyteller? And as soon as we sat down, I was like, oh, it's all radio. It's all the same rules. Don't have too many extraneous characters. Cut out any extraneous detail. Make sure you keep emotion in. Make sure that you, reset the scene and make the point, and don't have anybody assume information they wouldn't otherwise know. So that was how I got into it. And then I kind of quickly realized that I was quite good at doing the story coaching stuff. Actually, what it was I realized that I didn't know how I did it, and other people couldn't do it. And I kind of instinctively knew that wherever there's magic brain, there's income somehow. You've just got to figure out who will pay for that skill.
Right.
And so it took me lots of, hiring lots of brilliant teachers and coaches to help me figure that out. And now that's my job, is running storytelling workshops for organizations and trainings for organizations, and teaching people storytelling, mostly in the context of writing keynotes and presentations. But I still run my storytelling show. It's a kind of labor of love, loss maker that I do 4 or 5 times a year. True Stories Told Live is what it's called. And I love it.
I love that. Can we just go back to, because this is something I am endlessly fascinated about, can we go back to the impact of the brain on storytelling? Because every time I do a speaking gig, I share part of my story. And I feel like as soon as I've shared that part of my story, automatically people are now relating to everything that I
Yes.
said.
Yes.
And when I hear other people's stories, it makes me I feel like I know them, right? Like I was right there. So can we talk about how does the brain, you kind of touched on it a little bit. Can we just dive a little bit deeper on how the brain responds to, I guess, just being able to see ourselves in people's stories?
Yeah, so the brain responds to stories. I always used to say, when I would teach storytelling, before I knew the brain science, I always used to say, what you're trying to do when you're telling a story is you're trying to elicit a Freaky Friday style body swap between the person listening to the story and you in that moment. And now I understand that's literally how their brains are responding. That's why often when I'm running a workshop, I'll show my hand, like I can show you now, Jennifer. You can see my hand. It's fine. Mm-hmm. There's no band-aids. Yeah. There's no cuts. But if I tell you a story about how 3 weeks ago I was grating some beetroot and I accidentally grated my fingers, then you'll flinch. People will flinch, and that I'm fine. But you still flinch because we have these parts of our brain called mirror neurons, and they're the parts we use to empathize. And so you're empathizing with me of 3 weeks ago grating my fingers, even though intellectually, there's no problem. There's no reason to be worried about me. You still have this kind of visceral response. And, it's the reason why in movies we are on the edge of our seat in the horror movie or the thriller or whatever it is. It's why we cry when we read a sad book. Or hear a sad story. And so the same thing happens with storytelling. And I used to say that when somebody tells a story and everyone's listening, there's a kind of alchemy. There's an energy in the room. And what I realized is it's not alchemy, it's neurology. It's everybody's brains lighting up in the same place at the same time, like a giant benign alien invasion. But it's really powerful connection. And when you said, when you tell your story at the beginning, you feel like they're on board with you. I think that's absolutely true. And when I'm working with speakers, I'm always getting them to tell a story at the beginning. And I call it getting in the boat. It's like you tell the story at the beginning and the whole audience gets in the boat. And then they're just like, where are you going to row us, Jennifer? They're just with you. Right. And I think it's because you've activated all these completely different parts of their brain that they're not used to getting activated when they're sitting in a lecture hall. But B, because they saw themselves in your story because their brain was experiencing their story as you. And when you tell a well-told story, and I would say the most important part of a well-told story is to include answering the question, how did you feel? How did you feel? How did you feel? Because I haven't had every experience, but I have had almost every emotion. So if you tell me a story about, I don't know, the time that your car broke down and you were stranded on the side of the highway and you were really worried. I actually can't drive, so I've never had that experience. But if you talk about how worried you were and how nervous and how you felt embarrassed, why did I allow this to happen? I felt worried, I felt nervous, I felt embarrassed, and now I can relate to your story. And I think the other thing when you show emotions is that usually if you express emotions in storytelling, there's vulnerability in there. Unless the emotion is, I was happy, because my life is perfect all the time. But most stories that are well told don't have that. So when you show emotion, when you say, oh, I felt embarrassed, why didn't I get my car serviced? Then that shows me that you're not a perfect robot. And that makes me relax, because I'm not a perfect robot either. And so then I like you more and I trust you more. I feel better about myself as well. It does so many different things.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I mean, like, I'm telling a story to somebody and the circumstances of their life are very different than the circumstances of my life. But underneath the details, right, there's that connection. And I love it. You just created kind of visual in my mind when I'm picturing an audience of like, we're all energetic beings, and there's like this like energetic like web, right, connecting all of our brains. Like that's kind of how I was picturing it, right? Because we're all emitting the same kind of energy at the same time. And so now not only is it just like me and my story, there's this collective energy that's amplifying that.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I love that. I love that visual. And I think, we are all connected. And it's something I think about so much in our, the fantastically divided societies. And, I'm somewhat of an activist. I have very strong feelings about the rights that I stand up for. And I try not to get into fights on the internet, but sometimes it happens. And what I try and do, it happened recently. I got into a fight on LinkedIn, of all places. But what I really tried to do, I felt like it was important to stand up for, it was, not me who was being oppressed. It was another group of people, but I felt it was important to stand up for them. But I also tried to find empathy for the person I was butting heads with, and I tried to think about what would we have in common. And I even started the comment by saying, I want to start by saying, if we were having this conversation in person, I think it would be a very different conversation. You're clearly very passionate about what you believe in. Somebody who felt that they were standing up for human rights. I just felt that they were oppressing other people's human rights. But I, it's trying to see what we have in common, I think, is really the only way forward. And I think storytelling is such a beautiful way of doing that. Like I often talk about how when you're telling stories, if you think about how telling stories means that people, are now experiencing your story in their brain, you're literally growing empathy by telling stories and listening to stories. You're growing empathy. And so you're growing that experience of understanding between each other. And I believe that, lack of empathy is the root of so much evil in our world. I think that so many of the terrible things that we see wouldn't happen if the people making those decisions, who, if I may for a moment, are mostly cis, non-disabled men in charge of countries, just putting that out there. But I think if they could actually touch what it felt like to be the people who are, whatever it is, being bombed, being kidnapped, whatever it is, would they still do those things? Like maybe they wouldn't. And so growing empathy, I think, is so important when it comes to defeating evil. But the other thing is shame. I think shame is a huge driver of so much bad behavior. And I think also genuinely, honestly, the behavior of many of those men that we talked about, it's driven by shame and some, needing to be important in history so that they feel more loved.
Yeah.
And when we tell vulnerable stories, Brené Brown says, shame cannot survive connection. That connection is the antithesis of shame. And so when you tell a story about the time when, sorry that I'm assuming that you would ever be in a broken down car, Jennifer, but say when you're telling the story of your broken down car and feeling shame at not getting your car serviced, it makes me feel better about who I am, and it reduces my shame. Like your vulnerability makes me feel better about my vulnerability. I'm generally a person who gets along with everyone they meet. I find it super easy to get along with people, but there are a few people in some of my communities who I cannot stand. And whenever they show up, I think, oh "Ugh, this person's here." Ugh. And it felt so uncomfortable to me. I wanted to examine that. And I realized almost without exception, it's the people who don't show a lick of vulnerability. They only talk about how great everything is in their lives. And I
Right.
think partly I don't trust them, but honestly, mostly I think it's on some level. I think maybe you are perfect and you're going to judge me because I'm not good enough. And that's why I
Right.
don't like them, because it's a kind of protection. Well, if I don't like you, it doesn't matter if you judge me and find me not good enough because I already don't like you. And I think that if they
Yeah.
showed some vulnerability, I would feel better about myself and I also would like them more.
Yeah. Well, I feel like too, and I think this is especially true in the post pandemic world, that stories are even more like connection. Well, stories and connection are even more important than they've ever been, because I think
Mm-hmm.
people are feeling, disconnected. And then, layer on social media, everybody's highlight reel and all of that, people are feeling disconnected. So, we were talking about it in the context of, giving a talk or, in business or whatever that might be. But how does that play out? Like, how do you use story effectively, like in just day to day communications, going about your life? Like, you're not a speaker. How does story play into that and creating connection in that context?
Well, I think often how we get to know our friends is by swapping stories. I think we're telling each other
Mm,
stories about our lives. And when I say stories, I don't mean epic beginning, middle, and an end. Like it can just be a tiny little moment about a thing that happened. Um, but I think it's a really good way of getting to know people because it often shows your lens on the world. Like I feel like we've all had that experience where
right.
maybe you're somewhere, for me, it's often a conference and you're standing around, you don't know anyone, you feel a bit awkward. And then somebody tells a story and you think, I love you, new best friend. And for me, usually it's a story about something awkward that they did because I just assume. So one of the things with shame that I talk about a lot is that in doing this work for 11 years, what I've come to understand is that pretty much all of us, I'm allowed to swear on your podcast, aren't I? I'm allowed to say that word at least because you say it in the title. Pretty much all of us walk around all day, every day thinking that everybody else has their shit together and we alone don't.
Yeah.
Everybody else has a perfect family, a perfect career, a perfect relationship, and we alone don't. And then to cheer ourselves up, as you mentioned, we go on Facebook or Instagram and we see, and it's not just highlight reels, it's a compilation of highlight reels. And it can
Right.
feel like an assault when you're in that place of just people being like, oh, my family's perfect. Oh, I don't have a family. So when I go on vacation, it's actually relaxing. Me and my partner never have the same stupid argument over and over again. And it feels like an assault and it compounds that feeling of shame, and shame cuts you off from people. And then somebody
Mm-hmm.
tells a vulnerable story and it can just be something tiny like, oh, I went to order a coffee this morning and I accidentally asked for a smarte instead of a latte and I felt like an idiot. But then the barista drew a smiley face on my cup and then I felt better about
Right.
myself. And somebody tells that story and you think, oh, you're not perfect either. Maybe it's okay that I'm not perfect. And I
Mm.
think that's probably also the effect you're having, because I'm assuming when you do a keynote, the story at the beginning isn't listen to my perfect life. Everything went perfectly
Oh
forever.
no.
I'm the best. Follow me for 10 tips and make 6 figures a year. Like, I'm guessing that your story has some
Yeah.
vulnerability and it has some imperfection in it. And so we'll all relax because you're already up on stage. You're so cool up there. And also you just look really cool and are really cool. And so it's like, wow, if even this cool person isn't perfect, then maybe it's okay if I'm not. And so I
Yeah.
think in terms of day-to-day life, I think one of the main and most important ways is around that building connection, is around like getting to know people and telling them little stories as a way to kind of show your lens on the world. Because I think we've also, most of us, had the experience where we've heard someone telling a story and they're, crafting it perfectly and they're hitting all the beats. And you're thinking, wow, that's a fantastic story. I never want to be friends with you. And again, it's because it shows your lens on life, and so it's a good way of helping you find your people, and stay away from the people who aren't your people and are going to make you, feel bad, not
Yeah.
because they're doing anything wrong, but just because they're just not your person.
But we've all had these experiences with people who, like, you just meet somebody and they go off on this huge diatribe and they're telling you this very involved story, and like your eyes are glazing over and you're like, just get to the freaking point already. Like, I literally just met you. This is way too much of a story. How do you use it in a way that isn't like, because I mean, I had that experience actually not that long ago, and I'm trying to remain attentive to this person that I've just met, but they're like literally going on. And my first thought was like, holy, you're so self-absorbed. First of all, like you haven't asked me anything about me. You just met me, and now you're
Yeah.
like we're on minute 15 of the story of who you are.
Yeah.
And I was just like, and I actually thought about it because I'm like, this is like the antithesis of connection right here.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, there's a couple of things I want to say in there. One is how I deal with people who can't get to the point. And I would say a former can't get to the pointer, sometimes still a present can't get to the pointer. I actually have a friend who has known me since I worked in radio. And in radio, I would have to cut my stories from 20 minutes down to 20 seconds. And sometimes when we're together, if I'm a bit tired and I'm rambling, he'll just go, may I have the radio version, please? And I'll go, oh, I'll give him the edited down version. But what I do with those people, and I don't know, this might give people strong feelings because I know it's not good to interrupt people. I'm a person who has ADHD, so I spend a lot of time stopping myself from interrupting people. But when someone really won't get to the point, I'll often just kind of force the point by saying, oh my gosh, so what happened? So how did you get there? So what did he say? And they sort of are usually embarrassed enough that they feel they have to answer my question. And then the thing of people not asking questions, this is like, so I worked in radio, two things with that. One, I'm very adept at interviewing people. Two, 1 second of silence for most people is like 25 years of silence for me because I was taught to fear it. And so I often am really good at jumping in and asking questions, but it means I often have conversations where I'm asking all the questions. I'm not being asked any questions. And I would say the majority of people are bad at asking questions. And I've even been with people where I bite my tongue and I sit in the discomfort of the silence and I can feel them feeling uncomfortable with the silence, but they still don't know to ask questions. Like people just don't know that that's what they're supposed to do. And so often with those people, I think maybe you're not my person, but also I just start talking about myself. It doesn't feel great. But I find often when I do that, people actually are interested and they are game. They just didn't know, especially with, again, I don't want to make this all about gender and, gender's a construct and all of this. But I do find that cis men have been taught by society that they don't need to ask questions and that they are not good at it. Some women too, absolutely, non-binary people also, but I do experience it the most with cis men.
Yeah, that is so true because that is literally the scenario that I was explaining before, right? Where it was just like, wow, this guy like literally just talked for 15 minutes about how great he is and how he got to be so great. And, without like kind of, I guess like reading, like checking in with the person that you're talking to, like it becomes like, he's a talking head. And I was wondering in my brain, I'm like, would he be talking to another man the same way that he would be talking to me? Or is it because of like, there was all these things going on in my head while he was telling the story, right? Like there was a lot happening.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that I think women are, well, first of all, women, I think naturally are just more apt to downplay themselves in their stories.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And to not interrupt as much, she says, interrupting Jennifer. but we've been taught not to interrupt men. I mean, that was even a thing for me as a white person that I had to learn. I thought that when I spoke, everybody listened because what I have to say is so interesting and fascinating. And I had to learn that, when I'm in certain spaces and when I'm definitely that in the way is like, I'm white, cis, I'm non-disabled, straight people think I'm straight. And so when I'm in spaces where I'm the majority, where I'm not a marginalized person, everybody's been taught to shut up and listen to me. And so I've been taught that sometimes I need to shut up and listen. And men, and particularly white, cis, non-disabled men the most, we've all been taught to, like, I've been in situations where there's a bunch of us around a table. This happened to me a couple of times. And I've started talking, and a man who is there, who I know is lovely and thoughtful and a feminist, has just not heard me and just started talking. And I've shut up. And I've hated myself for shutting up. But it's just so built into me to be socialized to, like, keep the peace.
Yeah, because it's interesting. And, like one of the things I do in my work, is connect people back to their own stories, because this is what happens is women will come to me, and sometimes very, very accomplished, brilliant, smart, ambitious women will come to me, and they'll be like, I'm really stuck. Like, what's next? Where do I go from here? Like, I'm missing this in my life. And then we start talking about, I don't think I'm qualified for anything. And we start talking about their experiences and their stories. And these women have these incredible stories, like these incredible, but they tend to downplay it with I didn't do that by myself, or, that's just what I had to do in the moment. And so we're like downplaying these stories. So we're not even telling the fullness of who we are. Like, we're not giving the other person a chance to really even see that. So, like, what are some of the big mistakes that you find people make with telling their stories?
I think you're absolutely right that women in particular do downplay their stories and do. I even had a friend who she was dating and we were like, oh, what happened? And she told us like the most scant amount of detail. And luckily she was with friends where we were like, that's not, that won't do. You need to tell us some more. And she said, oh, I feel like I don't want to waste your time by telling a long story. And I said, you're actually wasting our time by telling such a short story, because you may as well have said nothing. Like, give us something. And so I think people often think that the biggest mistake in storytelling is putting in too much detail. And what I think it is not putting in enough of the right detail. And the right detail being sensory details, because that's another thing we can all relate to. Maybe I've never had your particular story, but you talk about walking through a field of wet grass in bare feet, and I can connect to you from a sensory perspective, and my brain responds in a sensory way. But the other one, the most important thing, is what I mentioned earlier, which is answering the question, how did you feel? Because when you tell us how you felt, it does so many things. It incites curiosity, because if you say, my car broke down and I was terrified, or even my car broke down and I was so excited, now we're drawn in, like, oh, what's it going to happen? And as humans, we hate curiosity. We're like desperate to close that gap, but we also love it. It floods our brain with dopamine and oxytocin. So it creates curiosity. It does the thing that we said of vulnerability and showing that you're human. It means that I can relate to your story, but also it shows us the stakes. I can't tell you how often I've seen someone tell a story on stage, but because they didn't talk about their emotion, I don't know how they felt. Like, maybe their car broke down, but that just didn't matter to them at all. So it's really hard for me to care about that story. If they said I went into the job interview, okay, I went into the job interview and I was terrified. Oh gosh, I hope it goes well. I went into the job interview and I felt so confident. Oh, I hope it goes well, and you don't get to feel bad. But we don't know, like, whether or not whether or not you care about that story. And I think also, while people tend to give too much context, another thing that I've seen is people not putting in enough context for me to know why the thing that happened matters. So I remember going to a conference once, and twice in one day, 2 different people told a story where somebody very significant died. But in both stories, they hadn't mentioned that person up until the point where they died. So it was really hard for me to be sad, because I didn't actually know that you had an uncle that you were close to. So when your uncle died, maybe they're a distant uncle, and so I think it's making sure that people understand, having just enough context to know why, if it's a story where like a thing happens, a dramatic thing happens, to know that. But the most important thing is answering the question, how did you feel? How did you feel? How did you feel? The other thing I would say is that I talk about stories in terms of action scenes. So my storytelling teacher is called Sage Turtle, and she gave me a sentence that I loved it because it made sense of everything that I teach. It was sort of this framework that dropped onto it, which is this: when you're telling a story, you're making a movie inside your listener or reader's brain. So if you think about movies, there are 3 different kinds of scenes. You have voiceover, disembodied voice from the future, giving context or philosophy. So if you think about Morgan Freeman at the beginning of Shawshank saying, there must be a Khan like me in every prison in America, I'm trying to think of other examples. So often I think of examples and I'm like, that person's problematic. I can't talk about that. Anyway, but you get it, voiceover in movies. So it's usually giving context or opinion. Montage. So montage is real-time scenes cut together with music. So if you think about Dirty Dancing, Learning the Steps montage, Rocky Training montage, High School Movie Makeover montage. And then there's action scenes. An action scene is basically any other kind of scene, any scene that's happening in real time, maybe slow-mo, but usually real time, all from the perspective of one or a couple of the characters. So if you had a whole movie that was voiceover, that's basically a long audiobook. It's not a good movie. If you had a whole movie that's montage, it's a super long music video. It's not an interesting movie. So most movies are mostly made up of action scenes. And when it comes to telling stories, it's the same. So an voiceover for a story, disembodied voice from the future, giving context or philosophy, could be when I was 19, I went traveling around Europe. I visited 9 different countries. I felt it was important to expand my horizons and meet people from different cultures. So you know what I did, you know my opinion on what I did, but you don't really know what that trip was like. Montage is little flashbulbs of pictures. So when I was 19, I went traveling around Europe. I drank red wine in Paris. I looked at the street art in Berlin. I walked the canals of Amsterdam. You know more about what I did, but you don't really know what that trip was like. But action scene is getting super granular. It's saying I'm standing on the subway in Paris when this woman stands up and starts walking towards me, and I panic because I don't speak French. And then she says to me in perfect English, I'm terribly sorry, you seem to have dropped your 200 franc note. So that's action scene. That's where the magic happens. That's where your brain thinks the story's happening to you. And I think the other mistake that I see people make is they're trying to tell stories in voiceover or montage. They're not stopping to describe, okay, what are the sensory details? Where are you? And how did you feel? And when you do those, when you just use action scenes, that's when you can get so much across. Like another way that storytelling comes up in the day to day is when you're trying to explain a concept to someone. You could tell a story, a theoretical story. Say I'm trying to tell you about like a piece of software. I could say, okay, you know, when, usually it gets to the end of the week and you see on your phone how many hours you've used it, and you see that it was 7 hours a day, and you think, oh no, that's awful. Why am I wasting my life on this phone? Imagine if instead there was something that, without being too annoying, stopped you from wasting time on your phone. And at the end of the week, you look at your screen time and you think, yeah, I really spent my time well this week. That's what this app OneSec does, which, by the way, is an app that changed my life on my phone. But so what I did was I told you a story about how your life sucks right now. And then I told you a story about how amazing your life is going to be. And then I introduced the thing that I want you to do. So it's also good when you're trying to persuade someone ethically of something, but it gave you, maybe I'm saying, okay, imagine if every time you went to your phone, instead of just going to Instagram and scrolling through, a little thing popped up that made you take a deep breath. And that's what this app does. And that's how it helps you not get on it. So I've just told you a story about what it does. And, we've either had emotion in there or some kind of implied emotion. And it gets my point across a lot more easily.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. So how can we, as women, especially because my audience is mostly women, how can we get more confidence, through our stories?
Do you mean confidence through your stories or confidence in telling stories?
Confidence in telling your stories, but also confidence in ourselves through our stories. Because, I had this experience, again, like I was saying, I did a speaking gig last weekend and I had this experience of like, sharing my story. And often I'm like, I don't think much about my story because it just happened in the way that it happened and I go on. But after I spoke, I had women coming up to me and reflecting my story back to me. And I had this, like, when as I was driving home from the event, I was like, oh, wow. Yeah. Like that actually did happen that way. Like, or like, yeah, that was a lot that I overcame, but I never actually think about it that way until I tell a story and then somebody reflects it back to me. And then that, like, I had a greater sense of like, yeah, I really went through some shit and you know what I mean? I conquered it.
So I think go ahead. In terms of confidence in telling the stories, practice really is the thing. And practice in low stakes environments, like practice with first of all, do not be afraid to practice at home out loud to an empty room. Like, I think it's a myth that people are just natural storytellers. Everybody I know who can tell any story and it's fascinating is kind of like me, where as soon as a thing happens, like the other night, the light came on outside my window and I poked my head out the curtain and there was a raccoon right there. And I'm from a country that does not have these glorious creatures. And so I was so excited watching this raccoon. My window was a bit open. It looked up and watched me for a little bit. And then eventually the raccoon wanders off and I lie down in bed, and immediately in my head, I start telling the story to someone. And so by the time I first tell somebody about the raccoon, I've actually told that story 2 or 3 times to myself in my head. So don't be afraid to practice your stories. And if you want to practice them out loud, that's even better. But alone in an empty room is completely fine. I do it when I'm biking. If you ever see me biking around Toronto, probably my lips are moving because I'm probably telling a story to some imagined future person. And then in terms of gaining confidence from it, it's telling the stories. And I think, again, you can start in low stakes ways. So family and friends is a low stake way. Another thing is, if you're on social media, if you're on Facebook, if you're on Instagram, tell stories and think of stories not as the kind of beginning, middle, and an end, but just those little action scenes, because often those are the most powerful ones. I just made a video that I put on Instagram and TikTok about a time when a tiny story rescued me, which was several years ago. It was basically like the worst period of my entire life, and there was lots of different things going on, and I was really isolated, like through no one's fault of my own, but I also felt that it was important to not tell anyone how much I was struggling, including the people that I was living with at the time. And so I did a lot of secretly sobbing on the bathroom floor, going into the bathroom as quietly as I could, sobbing, wishing that I could be obliterated. Like, it was awful. And I suddenly remembered on one of these sobbing sessions reading about somebody else secretly sobbing on their bathroom floor. And it was Elizabeth Gilbert in Eat, Pray, Love, which, if you haven't read the book, at the beginning, she's going through a divorce and she can't tell her husband, before the divorce, she can't tell her husband how unhappy she is. And I picked up the book just because I thought, I need to read about somebody else who is having this experience. My circumstances were completely different, but I just needed to read about somebody else who was secretly sobbing on their bathroom floor. And when I read those passages, I felt less alone. And so remember that your bombastic stories help people, but your tiny stories help people as well. And so practice telling those little stories. And as long as you include the answer to the question, how did you feel? People will relate to it. And if you don't want to give away too many details, then you don't have to, because really what's important is describing where you were and how you felt. Like, even in that story there, I have to be a little bit careful with the details because some of the people around me are still in my life, and it's not, nobody did anything wrong. There's nobody that we can blame for things, but there was another story that I told about the first time I'd ever experienced suicidal ideation. And at the time, part of the effect was that I was in a really bad relationship, but it was a bad relationship with a great person who is now a great friend. And so if I were to tell that part of the story, I'd be needlessly throwing them under the bus. But actually the story that I told was it's the most commented story on my blog. It's the most shared. And literally the narrative of the story is, I made a cup of tea. I saw some words written on the tea bag. I pulled those words off and put them in my pocket. And that's it, because the words said, there is a beauty in your presence. And at the time, my self-esteem was so low, I couldn't possibly believe there'd be a beauty in my presence. And I got, I put it up on Facebook. I got like 100 comments on it. It's been commented so much on my blog. And I didn't tell any identifying details in that because I just described the action scene. What did it look like and how did I feel? And those are the important parts. So practice telling those small stories. And then as you get more confident with those, you can start practicing telling the bigger stories. And I think you're absolutely right that I've had the same experience. I had dinner with a new friend recently, and I just was, we were kind of swapping stories about our lives. And she went, you should write a memoir, an autobiography. Your life's been amazing. I was like, has it? She said, you've had such an interesting life. I'm like, not me. And so, but the more you tell those stories, the more chances you have for people to reflect those things to you that you yourself can't see because you're in it. So it's normal to you.
Yes. Right. Well, and I think telling your story just to remind yourself that I am seriously badass, or I'm strong, or I'm whatever the thing is, right? Just to reflect yourself back to yourself so that you can see, because what is it they say? You can't read the label from inside the jar.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. There's a coach I love called Catherine North, who has an exercise where she makes you write out your victim story and your hero story. And so you tell either the story of your life or the story of a particular thing, first with yourself as the victim. Oh, Jennifer, that is easy. It is an easy peasy exercise to write about how hard done by I've been and everywhere in my life. But then you have to write the exact same story with you as the hero. And it was so illuminating to me. And when I did it, I had focused on like a particular hard thing that I had just come out the other side of and was feeling so hard done by. And when I wrote the hero story, I was able to see all these places where I had strength, all these places where I had built resilience as a result of this. My co-parent has a thing. She wrote a brilliant book, actually, a memoir called How to Lose Everything. And in it, she talks about her therapist saying to her, resilience sucks, because the only way you get resilience is by going through something awful.
Right.
And so when you can write that hero story, and this is just writing it for yourself, you know, Catherine doesn't ask you to share it with anyone, then you can see actually the ways that you have, you know, you can see your own strengths in it.
I love that. I love that. Because one of the things I learned very early on, you know, when I took a couple of speaking classes and things like this, right, was how to connect with my own story, because I was very disconnected from it. Like I literally couldn't see, you know, like lots of parts of my life, whether, I don't know if I blocked them out or whatever, but I was just very disconnected from my own story. And I will say that, you know, packaging and telling my story has given me a lot of confidence in myself, has given me a lot of confidence in my own abilities that I couldn't see before. So it's actually been a healing journey.
How did you do it? Sorry to interrupt.
Through a lot of what you just said, like, you know, it wasn't probably as eloquently packaged as your victim story versus your hero story, but I just started writing down snippets of like ideas or thoughts or experiences like that had come up for me. Right. And then I would just write them down randomly. And then eventually I started to see that, oh, okay, I see how that connects to that and how I moved from one place to the other. And then it became a little bit more cohesive. I worked on it. Like you said, I did a lot of practicing to whittle it down into a way that it had, you know, a nice flow to it that made sense. But one of the exercises I was given similar to yours was like to really tap into in each of these experiences that that were memorable for me, like what was the predominant feeling? Like where was I? Like what was the emotion? And so being able to lay it out that way and then you just see how all of the pieces put together, it really was, I will say it was a very healing journey.
Interesting.
And a way for me to see myself as, you know, because, you know, a lot of us are like, well, you know, my life was just boring. It just was. And everybody, I truly believe everybody has important stories that can teach somebody something or connect with somebody in some way.
I've been running my storytelling show for 11 years and I have never turned away a single person who wants to tell a story. Sometimes people have come and they've tried to tell me their grandmother's story. And one of the few rules of my show is it has to be outside of we do a ghost story show once a year. Outside of that, it has to be your own story. So sometimes I say, look, this isn't your story because you were 3 years old. You don't remember any of this. Come back to me with a story of yours. Once or twice people have come with a story that they're not quite emotionally ready to tell yet. You know, they say right from the scar, not the wound. And I think the way to figure that out is if you can talk to your friends about it without there being a lot of charge, then you're probably ready to talk about it. So sometimes I'll turn those stories away, but I've never, in 11 years of doing this show, I have never met a single person where I've gone, oh, sorry, you just don't have any stories. Because if you were alive and conscious, you have stories.
You have stories. Yeah. Yeah. And again, like viewing our lives that way is quite empowering, right? It's like, it's almost like, you know, when you go back and you review the previous chapters, it helps you to write the next one. And I talk about this a lot with my clients, right? Because, and I say this is because your life has set you up perfectly for where you're going to go next. You just can't see it. So going back and looking at these chapters, these ideas, right? It's like, oh, I can see how this story ends. And now all of a sudden you feel inspired to be able to write that next chapter because where you've come from gives you clues about where you're going. And even if you say, but I have no idea where I'm going, looking backwards will show you, will at least point you in the right direction. It might not be a specific thing, but it will point you in the right direction.
That's such a good and interesting and helpful point. Thank you.
No problem. But yeah, it's so fascinating. And I am, I do this podcast because I love people's stories. I love hearing, what drove them to do the thing that they're doing now. Like, where did that passion, come from? Why are you so excited about this thing? Like, I love those things. And unpacking those stories for me, again, like I see so many, you know, so much of myself, and I find so much inspiration and insight and ideas and wisdom in those stories that I'm like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way before, right? Because I hadn't experienced it that way. But I can learn from the way that you experienced it is now going to inform something for me.
Yeah.
This week I hosted a roundtable panel discussion with 3 other women who had also reinvented themselves in their 50s. And their stories, like, I left that just feeling like I'm on fire because their stories were so powerful, right? And again, like, their stories were very different than mine. Like, their circumstances of their life were very, very different. But those stories ignited things in me that I would not have been able to see had I not heard their particular story. And it's their particular story.
Yes, yes. My friend Erin Rogers, who's another storytelling teacher, says we all want to feel seen. We all want to feel seen. And when you tell your story to a room full of people, you feel seen. But when you sit in the audience and you see yourself inside that story, then you feel seen. And I see it every time, the keynote speakers that I've coached, when I'm doing keynotes, and at my show, I see it every single time, because when I'm working with the storytellers, I'm always digging to find what is the common touch point. So, for example, we had a storyteller called Set Shooter who told this story about going to see her doctors over and over again, getting dismissed. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. And finally, she discovers that she's going through early menopause at the age of 28. And so, it's a very striking story. Some people are going to resonate with the being dismissed by their doctors, but not necessarily most people in the room. But I was kind of digging around because I still wanted to find the point where, okay, what's the part that everyone's going to be able to relate to? And so when she gets diagnosed, she's just moved in with her boyfriend of 1 year, best relationship she's ever been in. And she decides she's going to tell him when he comes home. And they'd already established they didn't want to have kids, but she's devastated. No, she walks into the house and I said, what were you thinking? And she said, I was thinking I need to pack my shit up and I need to find somewhere else to live because he's not going to want to be with someone who's broken in the way that I'm broken. And when she said that, I was like, that's it. That's the moment, because all of us in some way can relate to that. All of us at some point have had that experience. Probably nobody else in the room has experienced going through menopause at the age of 28, but we all at some point have felt that feeling of this relationship, this job, this, friendship, whatever it is, this life is not for me because I am uniquely broken in this way. And it's so relatable. And so somebody says, and there's oh God, I'm going to blank on his name. It's a guy who he directed the latest Bob Marley biopic. His name's Marcus Renaud. I'll find it and I'll put it on the webpage I'm going to make for you. But I heard him being interviewed recently, and he was talking about how one of the ways that they got Bob was to make the actor skip a step when he went up the stairs. So instead of taking every step, he walks upstairs 2 steps at a time, because that was what Bob Marley did. And he said there is universality in the specific. When you can talk about specific things, people relate to them so much more than if you talk only in general terms. And so don't be afraid to talk about specific things in your stories, because that's how we'll be able to relate to them.
Oh, I love that, because personal is universal. That's something that I say all the time, right?
Yes.
Because we are so connected, and the human experience is the human experience. So what I'm experiencing is being experienced out there somewhere else. The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah. When I broke up with my very first girlfriend, and we hadn't been together that long, but it was such a a love affair. And I remember sitting in the taxi on the way to my mum's house in London and just feeling absolutely devastated. And I remember I had this thought, and it was almost like I had a vision of the world from space at nighttime, when you see all the lights on. And I thought, I cannot believe that right now there are literally millions of other people who feel this way, because this is such agony. But even in that moment of just complete wrenching heartbreak, I was aware that this was a universal experience I was having. And I think at that point, if I had listened to someone tell a story where they described it, and in fact, one of the ways I got out of that heartbreak was there was a band I really liked called Elbow, who released an album. And when they released it, the singer was deeply, deeply in love with his girlfriend. And the way that he described being in love, I listened to that and I was like, oh, that's what I felt. And because I felt that, that's why I'm in so much pain right now. But it helped me because I was almost like, oh, okay, well, that was worth it. You know, I feel awful now, but I only feel this awful because I felt so amazing. And it was him articulating it again, usually in tiny little moments of the way he describes. Yeah, remember he describes at one point his feeling like he's spinning and he's falling like a cloud of starling. And I'm like, that's how it feels when you're in love. It's like you're woozy. And it helped me remember, like, oh, she and I were so in love, and that's why I'm so heartbroken right now. And it helped me.
I love that. I love that. And it's funny that you brought up the car breaking down, because I literally had that experience like 2 weeks ago.
Oh, really?
Where my rental car broke down at night on this windy little road in the road
Oh
in the
my
mountains
gosh.
of Italy, stranded with no street lights and Italian drivers and Fiats flying by us at 100 miles an hour. Like it was scary. But anyway, I think it's funny that you brought that up.
That's so funny. And that's so lovely that you just ended there with like, that's such a beautiful little visual that you just gave us, right? We all just got that action scene in our brains now. We're all, you know, I've never been stranded on an Italian highway. But now I've touched the experience of what that's like because of the lovely little action scene you just delivered.
Yeah, so very coincidental that you brought that up at the beginning.
Or perhaps psychic.
Perhaps psychic. This has been a fabulous conversation. Thank you for unpacking this with me, because I am just such a believer in the power of story to connect, to inspire, and to empower us. Ourselves and other people. And I love that we just had the opportunity to kind of take it apart and talk about the different parts of the story and why that is so. So where can people find out more about you, your shows, to coach with you, or maybe to even invite you into their businesses?
So I am going to make a special secret website just for you people who are listening to this episode, which is going to be my website, Marsha, marsha.com/OCKS.
Okay, perfect. We'll make sure that gets in the show notes. Everybody go follow her on LinkedIn and Instagram, because she has incredible little story vignettes that she shares all the time, which are so entertaining and informative. Go follow her. And, you know, to those of you listening, I encourage you to really begin to think about your own story and like what you've learned from your own story, and also what you could share about your story that might help you rewrite the next chapter, or just help somebody else be able to navigate something a little bit easier because of what you've experienced. Thanks for listening to the Old Chicks No Shit podcast. If you like what you heard, the greatest compliment you could give us would be to comment below and subscribe. Or better yet, you could share this episode with a friend, a relative, or somebody you think could get something out of it. And remember, midlife is not the beginning of the end. It's simply the beginning of your kick-ass next chapter.